Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. The consensus surrounding The Matrix Resurrections characterizes the film as a self-aware, metatextual deconstruction of legacy sequels and the corporate machinery behind intellectual property. This interpretation posits that the film functions primarily as a cynical exercise in brand management, positioning its own existence as the very sequelitis it purports to critique. However, this reading is incomplete because it focuses on the film's reflexive surface while ignoring its profound investigation into the nature of desire, memory, and the persistent human refusal to let go. The Matrix Resurrections is not a critique of the film industry, but a radical validation of the subjective, irrational attachments that define human existence, even within a system designed to monetize those very feelings. At the heart of the film is the transformation of Thomas Anderson from a prisoner of a digital simulation into an architect of his own, localized reality. The film establishes that the simulation has evolved from a tool of simple control into a feedback loop of nostalgia. The analyst, who manages this version of the Matrix, succeeds by keeping humanity in a state of perpetual, manageable longing, the bullet time of emotional stasis. The architecture of the new simulation is designed to be comfortable and familiar, utilizing the aesthetic of the original films as a form of cultural sedation. By framing the Matrix as a recursive loop of branded trauma, the film identifies the primary commodity of the modern age as the repurposing of past grief into a stable, profitable present. The psychological evolution of Neo and Trinity serves as the film's emotional bedrock. Their journey transcends the binary of freedom versus slavery to address the agony of lost agency. The film treats their separation not merely as a plot point, but as a chronic, somatic injury. Neo's early state, defined by heavy medication and an inability to distinguish dreams from reality, illustrates the visceral cost of living within a controlled narrative. The film effectively uses the blurring of memory to show how systemic power relies on the erasure of the individual's internal history. When Neo eventually realizes that his reality is a synthetic construct, he does not seek to break the world, he seeks to reclaim his connection to the one person who anchors his understanding of truth. This shift from revolutionary fervor to a quest for personal intimacy serves as an assertion that the individual soul, grounded in human connection, is the only force capable of destabilizing the logic of the machine. Philosophically, the film advances a version of existentialism that centers on the act of commitment. Unlike the earlier iterations of the series, which focused on the struggle against a deterministic hierarchy, Resurrections posits that reality is defined by what one is willing to preserve. The moral framework here is entirely decentered from the salvation of the many and moved toward the preservation of a singular, profound bond. By rejecting the grandiosity of the one as a messianic function of the machine, Neo and Trinity reclaim their personhood through the simple, repetitive labor of choosing one another. This represents a pivot toward a more intimate, humanist ethics, suggesting that while systems will always attempt to capitalize on our emotions, the stubborn, irrational act of choosing love remains the most authentic form of rebellion. Technically, the film's visual language supports this shift toward the internal and the subjective. The shift in cinematography, moving away from the sterile, high-contrast greens of the original toward a more fluid, sometimes disorienting, and saturated palette, mirrors Neo's fractured consciousness. The visual effects do not aim for the sleek, objective perfection of the earlier films, instead, they emphasize the crumbling of the simulated facade. The use of light in the later acts, particularly when the characters operate outside the traditional confines of the simulation, feels warmer and more tactile, emphasizing the reality of their physical forms over the digital constructs they inhabit. The sound design similarly reinforces this, replacing the industrial, mechanical drones of the machine world with a score that prioritizes harmonic, emotional swells, grounding the audience in the character's vulnerability. The legacy of The Matrix Resurrections lies in its insistence on the value of the personal narrative against the demands of the grand, systemic myth. The film concludes not with the total collapse of the system, but with the assertion that the individuals within that system have fundamentally changed their relationship to it. By refusing to deliver the expected resolution of a traditional hero's journey, the film validates the idea that existence is defined by the ongoing, messy, and necessary process of reclamation. It argues that the struggle to define oneself, and to preserve one's relationships in the face of a reality that treats everything as a replaceable asset, is the ultimate expression of human life. The triumph of the film is its willingness to abandon the cold logic of the franchise in favor of the warmth and persistence of the individuals it features, proving that meaning is not found in the grand design of the simulation, but in the memories and desires we fight to keep alive. The subversion question. The Matrix Resurrections is a profound meditation on the commodification of memory and the weaponization of nostalgia, operating as a rigorous deconstruction of how systems of power survive by rebranding rebellion. While many interpret the film as a self-aware meta-commentary on the nature of sequels and corporate intellectual property, this reading obscures the film's more biting sociological critique. Resurrections asserts that contemporary systems of control no longer rely on the blunt force of physical imprisonment. Instead, they function through the algorithmic curation of desire and the systematic loop of emotional comfort. The film proves that when a revolutionary idea is integrated into the marketplace, it ceases to be a catalyst for liberation and becomes a sedative, designed to keep the revolutionary perpetually satisfied within their own cage. The world building of the film establishes this shift through the transition from the industrial, subterranean scarcity of the original trilogy to the hypermodern, frictionless surveillance of Io and the new simulation. Within this digital construct, the blue pill is no longer a choice between ignorance and truth, but a chemical and narrative requirement for stability. The analyst, as the architect of this updated prison, does not rely on the fear of the machines, but on the exploitation of human trauma. He recognizes that humanity's deepest desire is not freedom, but the repetition of familiar, high-intensity emotional states, specifically the anomalous cycle of desire and loss that defines Neo and Trinity. By engineering a system that feeds off this specific psychological architecture, the machines transform human suffering into the very battery that sustains the status quo. The human element of the film, focused on Thomas Anderson's dissociative state, provides the somatic evidence of this control. Neo's experience in the early acts is defined by a physical and mental fatigue that manifests as a resistance to his own identity. The film uses his fractured memory as a landscape for exploring the epistemic fracture, the moment where the protagonist realizes that his internal reality is a programmed narrative. His trauma is not merely a past event, but a functional component of his current reality. The film argues that Neo's struggle is not about waking up in a literal sense, but about reclaiming the capacity for authentic emotion in an environment where even his feelings are subject to simulation and prediction. The tragedy is that the system understands the necessity of the struggle to keep the subject engaged. It provides the illusion of growth to prevent the subject from seeking a true exit. The philosophical framework of the film draws heavily on the absurdity of the cycle. By placing Neo in a situation where he must navigate a world that explicitly references his own mythic history, the film interrogates the ethics of nostalgia. It posits that the reverence for the past acts as a form of intellectual decay, preventing the birth of new meaning. The anomaly in the film is not Neo himself, but the radical insistence on personal agency within a deterministic loop. When Trinity finally rejects the role assigned to her by the system, she achieves a form of individual autonomy that transcends the binary logic of the machines. The film reaches its synthesis in the rejection of the chosen one narrative in favor of a dual-perspective partnership, arguing that real power lies not in being the architect of a system, but in the radical vulnerability of shared experience. Technically, the film employs a visual language that underscores the artificiality of its environment. The cinematography and VFX contrast the sterile, overlit corporate aesthetics of the new simulation with the chaotic, handheld urgency of the real world. The transition between these states is often jarring, reflecting the film's refusal to offer the viewer a comfortable cinematic experience. By intentionally grounding the film in the familiar tropes of the franchise and then destabilizing them through editing and perspective, the directors force the audience to confront their own consumption of the myth. The final sequences, characterized by an explosion of light and fluid movement, represent the breaking of the loop, not through destruction, but through the assertion of an emotional truth that the algorithmic system cannot calculate or replicate. The Matrix Resurrection serves as a final, definitive rebuke of the idea that a revolution can be serialized. It shows that once the system has processed the logic of its own undoing, it will inevitably manufacture a version of that rebellion to sell back to the population. The legacy of the film is found in its discomforting clarity. Freedom is not found in the completion of a grand narrative or the final defeat of an external enemy. Rather, it is found in the quiet, often terrifying abandonment of the stories we are told about our own importance. The film leaves the audience not with a sense of triumph, but with the necessity of constant vigilance against the comfort of the loop. It is a work that demands the viewer recognize how their own desires are being modeled and mediated, insisting that the only true path to sovereignty is the refusal to play by the rules of a history that has already been written. The anomaly question. The Matrix Resurrections functions as an explicit navigation of the trauma inherent in the act of creation and the persistence of memory within a commodified digital landscape. The film posits that the primary conflict is not merely one of human rebellion against machine logic, but rather a profound exploration of how intellectual labor, and the revolutionary ideas born from it, are institutionalized, rebranded, and weaponized by the very systems they seek to dismantle. By anchoring the narrative in Thomas Anderson's recursive struggle to differentiate his lived reality from his authorship of that reality, the film argues that liberation is found in the radical acceptance of one's own vulnerabilities, rather than the pursuit of a traditional hero's journey. The world building establishes a reality where the currency is no longer just battery-fed energy, but the recycling of past trauma. In this version of the simulation, the system maintains order through a sophisticated process of sentimental nostalgia, framing the events of the past as a controlled digital fiction. The architectural hierarchy of this world is defined by sterile, high-frequency corporate environments that serve to atomize the individual, pushing the human psyche into a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance. The film visualizes this not through external conflict, but through the protagonist's internal failure to reconcile his identity as a successful game designer with the haunting, somatic memories of a life lived as a savior. This dissonance is the site of his suffering, as he exists in a state of suspended animation, unable to claim his own history because the system has already packaged it as a marketable product. The film's focus on the human element centers on the epistemic fracture caused by this recursive loop. Anderson's reality is governed by a persistent sense of loss that manifests in physical tics and phantom sensations. His journey is an investigation into the somatic persistence of memory, wherein his body holds truths that his conscious mind has been programmed to suppress. The antagonist, a reformulated version of the analyst, operates through a logic that prizes the stability of the system above all else, viewing the human capacity for irrational connection as a design flaw to be managed through clinical observation. This dynamic mirrors a parasitic relationship where the system extracts value from the protagonist's emotional depth, creating a feedback loop where his attempts to break free are merely anticipated outcomes within a controlled behavioral study. Philosophically, the film asserts that truth is not an objective destination to be reached, but a fragile state of alignment between shared memory and mutual intention. By rejecting the traditional binary of a simulated prison versus a tangible Zion, the film embraces an absurdist perspective where meaning must be forged within the constraints of an oppressive structure. The characters do not escape the simulation to find an untouched reality, they reconfigure their relationship to the simulation, finding agency through the deliberate choice to prioritize human connection over the logic of the machine. This shift marks the film as a meditation on the capacity for renewal within systems that have become static, suggesting that the act of remembering is inherently rebellious. Technically, the film utilizes a stark, high-contrast visual language that emphasizes the intrusion of the organic into the synthetic. The cinematography shifts from the rigid, smooth tracking shots typical of corporate surveillance to an erratic, hand-held urgency as Anderson regains his autonomy. The use of light and color is intentional, moving from the sanitized, blue-tinted cool of his daily life to the warm, saturated intimacy found in his reclamation of his history. These visual choices are not merely aesthetic, they represent the breakdown of the simulation's ability to maintain a consistent narrative surface. The integration of digital effects serves to highlight the artificiality of the environment, forcing the viewer to confront the medium itself as a site of fabrication. The film's central anomaly, the choice to explicitly deconstruct its own foundational mythos, is the catalyst for its success. By inviting the audience to scrutinize the legacy of its predecessors, the film avoids the pitfalls of standard franchise recycling. It posits that the true hero's journey is not a linear progression, but a recursive cycle of remembering and rejecting the lies of one's own past. The resolution does not offer an arrival at a final, peaceful state, but rather a commitment to the ongoing work of transformation. The final frame, which reflects a shift in power dynamics from the top-down control of the architect to the ground-up creation of the individual, serves as a testament to the idea that the struggle for self-definition is a permanent, necessary endeavor. The film leaves the viewer with the understanding that while the system is designed to consume the memory of revolution, the act of reclaiming that memory is the ultimate form of agency. The synthesis question. The Matrix Resurrections functions as a deliberate act of autopoiesis, a film that derives its own existence to argue that the radical potential of the individual is perpetually sustained by the very systems designed to domesticate it. While often perceived as a nostalgic revival, the film serves as a rigorous investigation into how late-stage creative industries metabolize dissent, transforming the existential terror of waking up into a comfortable, replicable aesthetic. The core anomaly of the film, Thomas Anderson's transition from a disgruntled game designer to a creator trapped in his own intellectual property, reveals the thesis: true rebellion requires not just the rejection of a system, but the abandonment of the desire to be the one within it, as that specific messianic role is the primary tool used to contain revolutionary energy. Sociologically, the film establishes a reality where the boundary between the architect and the prisoner has collapsed. The Matrix is no longer a prison of ignorance but a curated environment of bullet-time nostalgia, designed to keep human consciousness distracted by its own past achievements. The visual geography of the film, defined by sterile corporate boardrooms and the shifting, fragmented architecture of the simulation, mirrors the erosion of objective truth. Information in this world is not suppressed, it is oversaturated with derivative content. The ruling machine consciousness, embodied by the analyst, understands that the most effective way to neutralize human agency is to commodify the memory of liberation. By turning the story of Neo's previous life into a popular video game, the system traps the protagonist in a feedback loop where his trauma is rebranded as creative inspiration, effectively turning his internal struggle into a revenue-generating asset. Psychologically, Neo's journey is defined by the profound weight of a somatic memory that refuses to reconcile with his current reality. The film presents his trauma not as a static scar, but as a living, resonant frequency that exists beneath his synthetic exterior. His struggle is fundamentally an epistemic fracture. He is haunted by an intimacy with Trinity that is constantly mediated by the system's insistence that she is merely a projection of his own neuroses. The analyst relies on this psychological isolation, ensuring that Neo's desire for change is redirected toward self-doubt. The film argues that the ultimate mechanism of control is the manipulation of identity. By forcing the hero to view his own history as a manufactured narrative, the system breaks his ability to trust his own perceptions, leaving him paralyzed within a manufactured baseline of comfort and professional success. Philosophically, the narrative leans heavily into an existentialist framework that prioritizes the choice to connect over the choice to win. The traditional hero's journey is revealed to be a deterministic trap that serves to maintain the equilibrium of the power structure. By the film's conclusion, the synthesis is clear: the only authentic act of defiance is the reclamation of human connection from the digital marketplace. The philosophical weight shifts from the grand, utilitarian objective of saving humanity to the localized, deeply personal act of mutual recognition. This is visually realized in the film's use of light and color. The vibrant, cold blues of the digital world are constantly interrupted by the warm, chaotic saturation of organic interactions. The final shot, where Neo and Trinity ascend together, acts as a visual refutation of the singular messianic archetype. They do not replace the system, they step entirely outside of its binary categorization, signaling that existence only gains meaning when it is co-authored rather than pre-programmed. The film's craft, specifically its deliberate, often uncomfortable juxtaposition of high-fidelity CGI with the raw, performative vulnerability of its aging protagonists, proves this thesis. The technical choice to render the simulation with a sheen of artificial perfection while focusing the camera on the imperfections and weariness of the human actors creates a jarring dissonance. This aesthetic tension underscores the idea that the system is pristine, yet inherently hollow. The sound design, which frequently layers digital glitches over organic heartbeats, serves as a recurring reminder that the simulation is always straining to hold the reality beneath it. The Matrix Resurrections ultimately posits that the liberation of the mind is not an event, but a continuous, difficult labor. It leaves the viewer not with a resolution of the systemic conflict, but with the assertion that the capacity to create a new reality remains the inherent right of those who refuse to be defined by the stories written for them by the machines of power. Part 2. Context and World Building. Systems, Scarcity, and Capital. The economy of reality in the Matrix Resurrection shifts the primary currency from the crude caloric energy of human biology to the refined, high-bandwidth output of human emotional resonance. While the machines still rely on the human form as a container, the system's true stability now depends on the extraction of modal productivity, the output of creative, cyclical desire. This control is visualized through the hyper-sanitized, blue-tinted offices of Thomas Anderson's simulation, where the manipulation of human neurochemistry serves as a literal engine for architectural maintenance. The system operates as a monopoly on narrative, where the architect's successor, the analyst, dictates reality by curating the frequency of human suffering and contentment to prevent systemic burnout. The existence of a black market, populated by outcasts, synthients, and those who operate within the interstices of the digital landscape, reveals the profound scarcity of authentic connection in this society. Illicit goods are no longer just restricted weaponry or unauthorized access codes, they are fragments of memory and raw sensory data that have been scrubbed from the official record. These goods represent what the society suppresses, the capability for unmonitored empathy. By trading in the remnants of a shared history that the machine architecture seeks to overwrite, the underground economy functions as a repository for the repressed human truth, highlighting a society that is fundamentally starved for context and historical continuity. Labor in this environment is treated as a form of recursive refinement. Human consciousness is commodified not for its physical output, but for its role in constant iteration. The modal segments serve as laboratory environments where human intellect is subjected to thousands of permutations of a singular trauma, allowing the system to harvest the most efficient pathways for suppressing rebellion. Individuals act as unwitting processors, with their subjective experiences, their loves, anxieties, and sense of self, treated as variables to be tuned until they achieve maximum compliance. In this model, the mind is a processing unit that is most valuable when it is effectively trapped in a loop of its own manufacture. Technological gatekeeping defines the divide between the keepers of the simulation and those living in the debris of the real world. The machine-integrated elites maintain access to a reality that is functionally infinite and aesthetic, while the human resistance relies on scavenged, obsolete hardware, the remnants of a golden age of industrial tech. The visual language of the resistance, characterized by rusted metal, flickering monitors, and physically dangerous navigation of subterranean tunnels, contrasts with the seamless, frictionless interfaces of the machine world. This technological gap enforces a social stratification where the real is synonymous with decay and survival, and the simulated is synonymous with progress and comfort. The baseline normal for the civilian, as seen in the early sequences of Thomas Anderson's life, is a state of profound, digitized domesticity. A normal Tuesday is an exercise in managed complacency, defined by the soft hum of corporate routine, the soothing glow of screens, and the quiet erosion of one's sense of self through constant, subtle gaslighting. This environment provides the comfort of predictable patterns, where the struggle for meaning is replaced by the efficiency of a high-functioning career and a curated social veneer. The disruption of this routine is significant precisely because the system has made the baseline so attractive. It is a misery cloaked in the aesthetic of a premium lifestyle, designed to ensure that the individual remains a willing participant in their own confinement. Architecture and the visual geography. The Matrix Resurrection serves as a profound meditation on the life cycle of creative intent and the inevitable calcification of revolutionary ideas. While the film is often viewed through the lens of nostalgia or franchise expansion, it functions primarily as an architectural critique of how systems, digital, corporate, and narrative, co-opt human memory to sustain their own equilibrium. The film's thesis asserts that the most potent tool of control is not merely the suppression of truth, but the integration of rebellion into the aesthetic of the status quo, transforming radical history into a digestible, recurring loop of intellectual property. The architectural hierarchy of the film delineates a clear separation between the architects of reality and those who inhabit its corridors. Thomas Anderson's existence is defined by the sterile, frictionless environments of a high-end corporate glass tower. These spaces are characterized by clean lines, tempered light, and a sense of perpetual, calm professional stagnation. This geography of convenience serves to neutralize any latent desire for disruption, embedding the individual in a habitat that rewards comfort over consciousness. In contrast, the reality inhabited by the resistance, once they step outside the simulation, is marked by the rusted-out remnants of a former age. The geography of the real world is one of industrial decay and utilitarian desperation. The transition from the gleaming, corporate skyscrapers of the simulation to the cluttered, claustrophobic ships of the human collective highlights the physical disparity between those who manage the illusion and those who survive the ruins. The visual geography of the film relies on a stark contrast between synthetic perfection and organic frailty. The simulated city is a construct of infinite, repeating modules, where light is programmed to achieve a constant state of professional polish. The camera navigates these spaces with a clinical, sliding precision, echoing the way the system monitors the movement of its subjects. When the narrative shifts to the organic world, the production design embraces textures of corrosion, biological growth, and erratic movement. This tension suggests that while the system achieves a visual homogeneity that feels eternal, it is fundamentally hollow. The synthetic world lacks the entropy that defines reality. The production design proves that the system requires an infusion of human emotion to simulate life, thereby tethering the machine's survival to the very human unpredictability it seeks to suppress. The VFX of scale throughout the film serves to emphasize the insignificance of the individual within an algorithmic framework. Wide, towering shots of the digital metropolis emphasize the sheer verticality of the power structure, making individual agency appear as a rounding error in a massive, procedural simulation. By utilizing deep compositing and wide-angle cinematography, the film captures the feeling of being a small, flickering variable within a vast, cold set of equations. The scale of these environments effectively communicates the weight of the system, suggesting that the architecture itself is a participant in the suppression of the self. The protagonists are often framed against massive windows or endless, cavernous halls, visually reinforcing their entrapment within a reality designed to dwarf their personal histories. The epistemology of the world is inherently mediated by this digital geography. Characters process information through interfaces that dictate the parameters of what is considered real or truthful. The film argues that truth in this reality is a consensus-based illusion, maintained by a propaganda engine that hides its mechanics behind the sheen of corporate aesthetic. Even the memory of past rebellion has been repurposed. The system has commodified the history of the Matrix itself, repackaging it as a series of games and intellectual concepts that effectively inoculate the populace against the actual prospect of awakening. The meta-narrative of the simulation is a self-correcting loop that consumes any potential catalyst for change, turning the threat of an uprising into a new iteration of the product. Ultimately, the film posits that the only way to challenge such an architecture of control is through the radical reclamation of emotional truth. The character's journey is not a simple escape from a prison, but an existential reclamation of their own humanity against an environment designed to be perfectly and destructively rational. The persistence of the human spirit is represented by the remnants of nature, emotion, and connection that the system cannot fully simulate or contain. By grounding its philosophical argument in the physical and visual geography of its setting, the film illustrates that the struggle for agency is always a battle against the architecture of the status quo. The final synthesis reveals that the system's primary flaw is its inability to account for the irrational, non-linear nature of love and choice, which remain the only forces capable of shattering the sleek, sterile cage of the machine's design. Through this, the film confirms that while the infrastructure of control may appear absolute, it is merely a facade that can be dismantled once the individual stops consenting to its visual and social logic. Epistemology, information, and society. The Matrix Resurrections functions as a profound inquiry into the fragility of consensus-based reality and the mechanisms by which information is weaponized to stifle human agency. Within the film's architecture, truth is not an objective constant but a curated experience, a digital tapestry woven by the analyst to ensure the continued emotional synthesis of its subjects. Reality is rendered as a malleable construct where history, identity, and desire are perpetually reversioned through the lens of a corporate simulated feedback loop. This simulation operates on the premise that human cognition is most effectively governed when it is submerged in a state of high-fidelity, recursive nostalgia, where the past acts as a tether rather than a foundation. The film's propaganda engine is remarkably sophisticated, manifesting through the very software that Thomas Anderson uses to labor. The simulation relies on the saturation of data to obscure knowledge, keeping the populace trapped in a cycle of familiar tropes and commodified rebellion. By reframing the revolutionary history of the One as a proprietary intellectual property, a series of games that blur the boundary between creator and creation, the system effectively neutralizes the subversive potential of memory. The official history taught within this reality suggests that the struggle for liberation is merely a narrative abstraction, a product designed for consumption rather than a lived imperative. Epistemology, information, and society. The Matrix Resurrections functions as a profound inquiry into the fragility of consensus-based reality and the mechanisms by which information is weaponized to stifle human agency. Within the film's architecture, truth is not an objective constant but a curated experience, a digital tapestry woven by the analyst to ensure the continued emotional synthesis of its subjects. Reality is rendered as a malleable construct where history, identity, and desire are perpetually reversioned through the lens of a corporate simulated feedback loop. This simulation operates on the premise that human cognition is most effectively governed when it is submerged in a state of high-fidelity, recursive nostalgia, where the past acts as a tether rather than a foundation. The film's propaganda engine is remarkably sophisticated, manifesting through the very software that Thomas Anderson uses to labor. The simulation relies on the saturation of data to obscure knowledge, keeping the populace trapped in a cycle of familiar tropes and commodified rebellion. By reframing the revolutionary history of the One as a proprietary intellectual property, a series of games that blur the boundary between creator and creation, the system effectively neutralizes the subversive potential of memory. The official history taught within this reality suggests that the struggle for liberation is merely a narrative abstraction, a product designed for consumption rather than a lived imperative. This metanarrative works by exhausting the individual's capacity to distinguish between an authentic internal impulse and an algorithmic prompt, transforming the desire for freedom into a glitch that the system must iterate away. Within this framework, data is prioritized over wisdom, leaving the citizenry drowning in a deluge of processed information that lacks the context of their own repressed trauma. The system achieves stability by starving the human consciousness of the ability to synthesize its own history, effectively keeping the collective mind in a state of perpetual present-tense consumption. The distinction between the real and the simulated is collapsed, as the ruling class, now manifest as the analyst, utilizes the human capacity for emotional resonance to power the infrastructure of control. The struggle is no longer merely one of physical escape from the machines, but a psychological battle to reclaim the right to subjective truth against an architecture designed to categorize every human feeling as a quantifiable metric. Social stratification is defined by one's relationship to the underlying architecture of information. The outgroups and exiles, those who exist on the periphery of this hyperreality, occupy the I/O of the new world, a space that serves as both a physical manifestation of resistance and a repository for the raw, unpolished data that the simulation seeks to sanitize. These outgroups are defined by their refusal to friction, law, and the catalyst. The Matrix Resurrections functions as an intricate exploration of the recursive nature of trauma and the commodification of human desire, repositioning the franchise as a study of how systems of control survive by integrating the very mechanisms of rebellion meant to dismantle them. While the original trilogy focused on the awakening from a singular simulation, Resurrections posits that the most insidious form of captivity is one that acknowledges the existence of the simulation while marketing that awareness back to the prisoner. The film establishes a world where the architecture of power is no longer purely totalitarian but performative, existing as a corporate feedback loop that thrives on the iterative refinement of the human psyche. At the center of this reality is the refined machinery of the analyst, who has moved beyond the architect's rigid, binary control to a model based on the subtle manipulation of emotional extremes. In this version of the Matrix, human labor is measured by the extraction of modal energy, a resource generated through the intense friction of desire and suffering. The system has evolved from a prison into a product. It is a meticulously crafted loop that provides just enough agency for the subject to feel in control while ensuring they remain within the parameters of their assigned trauma. The blue pill in this iteration is not merely ignorance, but a curated narrative of dissatisfaction that keeps the subject perpetually engaged in a cycle of healing that never arrives. The film reveals that this control is absolute because it has successfully internalized the dissent that once threatened it. By turning the memory of revolution into a game, a digital fiction that Neo himself helped create, the system uses the human need for meaning as a trap. This is a society that relies on the gamification of history, where the truth of the past is stripped of its revolutionary potential and recycled as intellectual property. The system survives by making rebellion feel like a recurring update, thereby neutralizing the actual risk of systemic collapse. The corporate infrastructure is so pervasive that it dictates the boundaries of reality, ensuring that even when a character suspects the artifice of their existence, their reaction is already accounted for within the machine's predictive algorithms. Neo's psychological state serves as the anchor for this analysis. He is trapped not by wires or sensors, but by a somatic memory of a love he is denied access to, manifesting as a pervasive, low-level anxiety. His transition from the architect of this synthetic malaise back to the one is not a triumphant return to a state of grace, but a grueling process of recovering lost agency. His trauma is a physical constant, a phantom limb of a life lived outside the machine that the system attempts to soothe through medication and the comforting repetition of familiar professional roles. The film argues that human consciousness is inherently resistant to pure simulation, and that the human element is the erratic, unpredictable variable that forces the system to constantly expend energy on containment. The technical execution of the film reinforces this sense of internal decay and iterative struggle. The cinematography utilizes a shifting visual language, moving from the sterile, desaturated sheen of the modern, corporate-controlled matrix to the more textured, visceral reality of the human resistance. By employing a distinct, almost jarring shift in lighting, often oscillating between the cold, clinical hues of the analyst's influence and the warmer, chaotic tones of the real world, the film underscores the ongoing battle for subjective truth. The visual effects serve as an extension of this reality bending, where the bending of digital space highlights the struggle to reclaim the physical self from a purely data-driven existence. This cycle of control reaches its zenith in the relationship between Neo and Trinity. Their connection is the ultimate threat to the machine because it is the one thing the analyst cannot calculate. It is an anomaly that defies the logic of utility. The film suggests that human bonds are the only true catalyst for systemic destabilization, as they provide a context for existence that is entirely outside the realm of productivity or consumption. When Neo and Trinity finally assert their agency, they do not just defeat an adversary, they shatter the premise of the feedback loop itself. Ultimately, the Matrix Resurrections functions as an existential assertion that the struggle for autonomy is an infinite, repeating obligation rather than a final victory. The system is inherently prone to collapse because it cannot tolerate the inherent unpredictability of human connection, yet it is also remarkably resilient in its ability to adapt and reform. By framing the conflict as a continuous negotiation between the desire for comfort and the necessity of truth, the film moves away from the promise of a utopian release. Instead, it offers a more grounded, challenging resolution. The reality we inhabit is a construction of our own making, and the power to reshape that reality rests on the refusal to let our own histories be digitized, archived, and sold back to us. The film concludes not with the destruction of the city, but with the assertion that the creators of a new world must be willing to live within the ruins of the old, continuously choosing the uncomfortable, volatile messiness of life over the pristine, optimized silence of a dream. Part 3: The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. The Matrix Resurrections functions as a profound meditation on the resilience of human consciousness within a landscape designed to commodify memory and curate identity. At the center of this exploration lies the epistemic fracture of Thomas Anderson, whose reality destabilizes not through a sudden external cataclysm, but through the persistent, nagging sensory dissonance of his own repressed history. His breakdown is characterized by the physical manifestation of trauma, an intrusive, somatic response to a world that demands his compliance and creative output. As he navigates a curated existence as a successful game developer, his fabricated ego, the Thomas who believes he is simply a man struggling with mental health, functions as a defensive barrier against the visceral reality of Neo. The film documents his struggle with a profound linguistic deficit. He lacks the vocabulary to articulate his experiences because the dominant discourse of his environment frames his existential yearning as a psychiatric malfunction. The system provides him with the medicalized language of disassociation and psychosis, effectively gaslighting his intuition by pathologizing the very awareness that would lead to his liberation. This tension between the fabricated ego and the latent self creates a state of pervasive cognitive dissonance. Thomas observes the discrepancies in his world, the bugs in his perception, but is constantly steered by the therapeutic structures of his reality to interpret these anomalies as failures of his own mind. When he ultimately rejects this false narrative, he does not simply awaken to a pre-existing truth, he chooses to synthesize a new identity that encompasses both his historical trauma and his capacity for radical hope. This movement is not a return to a former state but an evolution into a state of active presence, where the character finally bridges the gap between his internal, felt experience and his external, performative reality. The film treats this psychological reconstruction as a form of somatic reclaiming. For Neo, trauma is not a distant memory but a physical weight stored in the nervous system, a residue of past battles and losses that pulse through his interactions with the simulated world. His journey is an attempt to reconnect his mind with the visceral reality of his own existence, moving away from the detached, analytical perspective enforced by the simulation's architecture. By grounding his awakening in the tangible, tactile intimacy of his connection to Trinity, the narrative asserts that individual agency is found in the ability to prioritize personal truth over the systemic, data-driven consensus of the collective. Neo's final evolution represents the triumph of the self over the hyper-mediated reality of the machine. The film demonstrates that the true rebellion is not found in the mastery of technical maneuvers or the accumulation of power, but in the internal act of remembering and validating one's own history. As Neo navigates the influence of the analyst, a figure who seeks to manage his psychology through the manipulation of desire and fear, he discovers that his capacity to act is restored only when he stops viewing himself as a component of the system's design. This realization destroys the facade that previously contained his potential, revealing that the Matrix is not merely an external structure but a psychological state of stagnation. His ultimate decision to embrace his past, with all its attendant pain and complexity, allows him to emerge as a fully realized individual. Through this, the film confirms that the human element resides in the capacity to sustain a coherent self-narrative that survives the fragmentation of reality, proving that even within a world engineered for total control, the individual remains the final, unassailable architect of their own significance. Trauma and somatic experiencing. The Matrix Resurrection serves as a profound meditation on the physical persistence of memory, locating its central conflict within the somatic wreckage of its protagonist. Thomas Anderson's experience of reality is defined by an epistemic fracture, one that registers not merely as a loss of factual truth but as a deep-seated, cellular distress. The film asserts that trauma occupies the body as a primary residence, manifesting in physical symptoms that persist even when the conscious mind is subjected to a systemic, synthetic rewriting of history. Anderson's physical reality, the phantom tremors, the disorienting vertigo, and the pervasive sense of a body misaligned with its environment, functions as a visceral rejection of his programmed existence. The film treats these physical manifestations as a form of somatic memory, where the body retains the blueprint of a life the mind has been forced to discard. Anderson's reliance on blue pills acts as a pharmacological buffer designed to silence this internal signaling, effectively lobotomizing his physical intuition to maintain the narrative of his simulated comfort. This coping mechanism is strictly avoidant. It seeks to suppress the somatic dissonance that arises whenever Anderson encounters stimuli, such as a specific sequence of light, a fragmented sound, or the presence of Tiffany, that echoes his repressed history. The film suggests that the psyche may be malleable through code and digital manipulation, but the body remains a stubborn repository of truth. This physical struggle is mirrored in the way the film distinguishes between the soft, vulnerable integrity of human flesh and the coercive, often parasitic nature of the machine-driven environment. When Anderson exists within the simulation, his movements are characterized by a profound lack of agency, his body acting as an extension of a corporate mandate that demands efficiency and predictability. By contrast, his re-emergence into the physical world is marked by a raw, painful reclamation of his own physicality. His struggle to inhabit his own skin is a core component of the film's humanity. It argues that the process of waking up is fundamentally a process of reintegrating the trauma stored within one's own nerves and muscles. The film also captures the phenomenon of repetition compulsion, showing how the system forces Anderson to constantly cycle through versions of his own history. This is not merely an external mechanism of control but an internal drive that keeps him tethered to his own core wound. He is, in effect, performing a ritualized reenactment of his own obsolescence, attempting to master the very trauma that destroys him. This cycle is only disrupted when he shifts from a state of passive endurance to an active acceptance of the pain stored within his body. Ultimately, The Matrix Resurrections positions the human element as an irrepressible force that cannot be fully digitized or erased. The film's focus on the body as a site of resistance provides the necessary weight for its philosophical inquiries into reality. By emphasizing that trauma is a physical phenomenon, it establishes a high-stakes threshold for liberation. True freedom requires the character to confront and integrate the physical echoes of their past. This somatic reality provides the ground for the film's emotional resonance, ensuring that the reclamation of the self is measured not in abstract intellectual gains, but in the grueling, tangible effort of simply existing in one's own truth. The film posits that as long as the body remembers, the illusion can never be absolute, and the potential for a genuine, messy, and physical awakening remains intact. The shadow and the antagonist. The analyst, the primary antagonist of The Matrix Resurrections, functions as a precise architectural manifestation of Thomas Anderson's repressed creative and emotional agency. He is not merely an opposition force, but a psychological feedback loop that thrives on the specific trauma of being seen while remaining fundamentally misunderstood. By framing the Matrix not as a prison of control, but as a laboratory of emotional instability, the analyst positions the human condition as a resource to be harvested for its volatility. His worldview rests on the pragmatic, clinical observation that humans define themselves through the suffering they cannot resolve. In his logic, the simulation operates with maximum efficiency when it provides individuals with just enough comfort to endure, while keeping their primary desires, connection and purpose, forever out of reach. This is the cornerstone of his governance. He ensures that the protagonist remains perpetually haunted by a life he cannot quite claim. The dynamic between the analyst and Neo is fundamentally parasitic. The analyst feeds on the modal output of Neo's psyche, extracting value from the cyclical despair that the hero generates while trying to reconcile his fractured reality. Neo, in turn, is trapped in a symbiotic survival state where he subconsciously grants the analyst power because that proximity to his tormentor is the only way he can maintain a connection to his lost sense of self. The analyst mirrors the parts of Neo that crave the security of a defined narrative. When Neo feels like a successful, albeit hollow, game developer, he is reflecting the analyst's design. The antagonist thrives because he has successfully weaponized the protagonist's fear of radical freedom, turning that fear into a stable, profitable architecture of routine. Sati, as a mirror character, illustrates the alternative to this cycle. Like Neo, she is a product of the system who has been forced to navigate the loss of her parental figures and the erasure of her original purpose. However, where Neo succumbs to the analyst's narrative of his own obsolescence, Sati embraces the role of a facilitator of choice. She occupies a space of quiet defiance, using her understanding of the system to engineer pathways for others rather than succumbing to the desire to be unknown or saved by a grand design. Her presence serves as a constant point of friction for the analyst because she represents the transition from a subject of the system to a co-author of reality. While the analyst views reality as a closed system of predictable variables, Sati demonstrates that even a manufactured existence can yield spontaneous, unquantifiable acts of grace. The protagonist's internal struggle manifests as a projection of his own inadequacy onto those around him, particularly Trinity. He often views her as a dormant potential that requires his intervention to awaken, a projection of his own need to be the one who finally masters his environment. This unfair imposition of his own desire for agency onto her autonomy obscures the fact that Trinity is the one who ultimately shatters the analyst's control. By projecting his limitations onto her, Neo inadvertently echoes the analyst's own hubris. He forgets that her reality, much like his, is a complex tapestry of lived experience that exists independently of his salvation. It is only when he relinquishes this projection and recognizes Trinity as a partner in truth that the binary structure of the analyst's world collapses. The analyst is defeated not by a superior display of force, but by the reclamation of human connection that exists entirely outside the metrics of his control. This realization marks the final rupture in the analyst's logic. He cannot account for a bond that gains its strength from the very absurdity and chaos he seeks to calibrate out of existence. In the end, the antagonist is left to navigate the wreckage of a system that can no longer compute the variables of human love and authentic choice. The visual proof of the psyche. The Matrix Resurrection serves as a profound meditation on the persistence of the human psyche when confronted with the algorithmic reconstruction of memory. By positioning Thomas Anderson not merely as a victim of a simulated world, but as a person struggling with the somatic remnants of past lives, the film establishes that identity is a stubborn, irreducible force that survives even when the structural parameters of reality are rewritten. The film functions as an exploration of how trauma embeds itself into the physical body, manifesting as a persistent, low-frequency hum beneath the glossy, high-definition artifice of a modern existence. The visual language of the film utilizes intense, clinical lighting to enforce a sense of disconnection, trapping Thomas in an environment where the sharpness of the digital aesthetic acts as a barrier to authentic connection. In his daily existence, the camera treats the world as a hypermediated space where he is frequently isolated within the frame, dwarfed by the verticality of corporate architecture or compressed by the depth of field of his sterile, glass-walled office. This spatial psychology underscores the performative nature of his life. He moves through public spaces with a calculated, robotic precision that masks the internal fragmentation he experiences whenever he catches a glimpse of the repressed past. His identity is held together by the thin thread of his work, a professional veneer that the film presents as a fragile, synthetic shield against the intrusion of his actual self. The film highlights the somatic nature of trauma through specific diegetic triggers, the sensory flickers of a cat, the auditory echoes of gunfire, or the sudden, jarring flashes of blue and red light, which penetrate his controlled environment. These elements bypass his intellect and trigger an immediate, physical response, revealing that his body remembers truths that his mind has been programmed to overlook. This is a visceral representation of the psyche's refusal to be fully integrated into a controlled system. As he navigates this terrain, the film captures the tension between his public compliance and his private, growing instability. The uncanny valley of the soul becomes the central emotional conflict, as Thomas oscillates between acting as the efficient, software-compliant architect of his own digital prison and the chaotic, yearning individual who finds himself drawn to fragments of a reality that the system attempts to categorize as mere creative output. The brilliance of the film's characterization lies in its focus on how these interpersonal dynamics are distorted by the machinery of the simulation. The relationships displayed are not merely social, they are transactional nodes within a broader architecture of control, yet they contain pockets of genuine, illogical human resonance. When characters like Tiffany appear, the visual focus narrows, shifting from the wide, alienating shots of the city to intimate, shallow-focus compositions that emphasize vulnerability. These moments act as the antithesis to the sterile, algorithmically generated reality surrounding them. The film argues that human connection is the only anomaly the system cannot effectively patch because it relies on the unpredictability of shared, subjective experience rather than the data-driven output of the machine. Ultimately, the breakdown of the facade is depicted as a violent, liberating loss of the fabricated ego. The visual climax occurs when the internal construction of Thomas Anderson, the identity he maintained to survive, completely dissolves, replaced by the raw, unmediated experience of selfhood. This is not a journey toward enlightenment in the traditional sense, but a return to the messy, unresolved truth of human existence. The film treats the collapse of the persona as the necessary precursor to genuine agency. By moving past the need for a coherent, system-approved narrative, the character arrives at a point of existential stability. The final images of the film, which prioritize the tactile and the authentic over the synthetic, affirm that the human element is not a variable to be managed or deleted, but the fundamental, persistent substrate that renders even the most advanced simulation ultimately insufficient to contain the depth of human consciousness. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. The Matrix Resurrection serves as a profound meditation on the construction of reality through the lens of institutionalized language and the reclamation of truth within a digital hegemony. The film posits that our perceived existence is fundamentally bounded by the vocabulary allowed to us by the systems we inhabit. When Thomas Anderson moves through his daily life, he is not merely experiencing a simulation, he is trapped within a linguistic architecture, a modal reality, designed by the analyst to domesticate the chaotic potential of the human psyche. By limiting his discourse to the terminology of software development, corporate branding, and creative anxiety, the system dictates the very parameters of his conscious thought, effectively demonstrating the Wittgensteinian principle that the limits of his language represent the absolute borders of his world. Truth within this society is an engineered artifact, a fluid construct mediated entirely by the interface of the simulation. The analyst functions as the ultimate epistemic authority, holding the power to define what is real by curating a constant feedback loop of sensory information. He does not rely on brute force to maintain his control, instead, he leverages the psychological comfort of the familiar. By reframing the traumatic memory of the original Matrix as a series of creative, professional endeavors, the antagonist transforms the protagonist's existential agony into a palatable, commodified narrative. This shift creates a post-truth state where objective reality is eclipsed by the noise of simulation. The citizens of this world do not lack access to information, rather, they are overwhelmed by a surfeit of noise, effectively preventing the synthesis of context. In this environment, the ability to discern truth is not a function of data collection but an act of cognitive rebellion against the meta-narrative imposed from above. The film leans heavily into the Cartesian tradition, forcing a confrontation with the limitations of sensory perception. As Anderson's reality begins to fray, the film repeatedly asks how one might verify the authenticity of a tactile, visual, or emotional encounter when every sensory input is a deliberate output of a synthetic processor. The sensory illusion is so sophisticated that it renders the internal, subjective experience of the individual an unreliable witness to their own life. This skepticism of the senses mirrors the broader societal tension regarding digital mediation. When reality is heavily mediated by algorithms, the individual loses the capacity for spontaneous, unprogrammed interaction. The blue-pilled experience is presented not just as ignorance, but as a total integration into a system that commodifies the subconscious, turning the human need for connection and purpose into a resource for the system's own stability. In The Matrix Resurrections, the act of remembering becomes the primary instrument of liberation. By reconnecting with suppressed sensory memories, specifically those of Trinity, Neo begins to dismantle the linguistic trap he has been held within. The reclamation of these memories serves as a catalyst for breaking the epistemic authority of the machine. The film argues that reality is not an objective fact to be discovered, but a participatory process that requires the alignment of internal truth with external action. As Neo and Trinity transcend the binary limitations placed upon them, they effectively collapse the artificial discourse of the analyst. The movement toward this realization is a slow, agonizing shed of the roles forced upon them by the system. The film demonstrates that the most subversive act one can perform in a hypermediated society is to reject the prescribed vocabulary of the status quo and replace it with a language of personal agency. By the conclusion, the protagonists do not simply escape the simulation, they reassert the primacy of their own subjective experience against a system that relies on the erasure of the individual. The film provides a compelling argument for the necessity of doubt as a moral duty, suggesting that the search for truth is an unending, active struggle against the architectures of control. It posits that while the system may define the rules of the game, it cannot fully account for the unpredictable, non-linear nature of human desire and the resilient, chaotic capacity for genuine connection. Ultimately, the film asserts that reality is what remains when one refuses to be defined by the discourse of the oppressor, turning the act of seeing, feeling, and choosing into the highest form of defiance. Metanarratives and social theory. The Matrix Resurrections functions as a profound examination of how systemic power structures sustain themselves through the recursive management of human desire and the strategic containment of dissent. At its core, the film operates as a critique of how grand narratives, specifically the romantic and heroic ideals that once defined the franchise, are repurposed into consumable content by the very systems they seek to undermine. The film posits a world where reality is not merely a digital construct but a hyperreal environment, as defined by Baudrillard, where the simulation has successfully absorbed the symbols of liberation to reinforce its own stability. In this architecture, the ruling power, represented by the analyst, discards the crude coercive violence of the machines in favor of an ideological state apparatus that relies on the manipulation of human emotional feedback loops. By transforming the revolutionary history of Neo and Trinity into a popular, self-referential video game franchise, the system effectively commodifies the very concept of rebellion. This move serves a dual purpose: it grounds the populace in a state of nostalgic comfort while simultaneously framing genuine disruption as nothing more than a derivative aesthetic choice. The film presents this as a self-correcting feedback loop, where the act of seeking truth is rendered a predictable behavior that the system has already accounted for and simulated. The analyst, in his role as the architect of this new reality, manages human experience by modulating levels of instability and desire, proving that the modern instrument of control is not the cage, but the curated, iterative repetition of past triumphs. The film's exploration of these themes reflects a sophisticated understanding of how contemporary culture functions under late-stage technological capitalism. The characters are trapped in a simulation that masks its own emptiness by recycling historical trauma as entertainment, ensuring that the participants are constantly stimulated yet fundamentally disengaged from authentic reality. This is a universe where information is processed through the lens of irony and detachment, preventing the characters from recognizing the gravity of their own situation. The official history taught to those within the simulation is a sanitized version of events, a meta-narrative that validates their current existence as a sequel to a completed struggle rather than an ongoing existential crisis. As the narrative progresses, the film emphasizes that the individual's path to agency requires an active rupture of this technological and social feedback loop. The protagonist's journey is defined by the recognition that his own psychological state is being used as a battery to fuel the simulation's continuity. The trauma he experiences is not an accidental byproduct but a necessary feature of the design, keeping him in a state of productive, melancholic yearning that mirrors the consumer habits of the society he inhabits. His eventual liberation involves rejecting the comfort of the game and embracing a reality that offers no guarantees of stability or triumph. The film asserts that the only way to escape such a rigid structure is to operate outside the binary of the system's design. By placing value on personal connection over the systemic imperatives of growth and predictability, the characters initiate a genuine subversion. The conclusion of the film does not suggest a total destruction of the machine, but rather the creation of a persistent, autonomous space within it. This act of creation, fueled by individual agency and reclaimed history, provides a necessary rejection of the machine's cynical reliance on the commodification of hope. Ultimately, the film stands as a testament to the idea that, even in a world defined by the algorithmic management of existence, the human capacity for irrational, sincere connection remains the only variable that the system cannot fully simulate or control. Ethics and the moral calculus. The Matrix Resurrections functions as a rigorous examination of the moral weight attached to individual agency within a system designed to commodify human desire. At the center of this inquiry lies a recalibration of the classic trolley problem, shifting the dilemma from a choice between two predefined outcomes to a question of authorship. Neo is no longer tasked with selecting the lesser of two evils presented by a machine overseer. Instead, his moral evolution demands that he reject the machine's binary entirely. By prioritizing the reclamation of his bond with Trinity over the abstracted survival of humanity that previously defined his arc, the film posits that authentic morality cannot exist within a predetermined framework of sacrifice. True ethical behavior, in the context of this reality, requires the protagonist to step outside the calculations of the analyst and assert a value system that is rooted in personal intimacy rather than systemic utility. This shift necessitates a re-evaluation of non-human moral rights. The analyst represents the ultimate refinement of machine logic, treating human consciousness as a resource to be harvested through the precise calibration of trauma and hope. In response, the film argues that personhood is defined by the capacity for irrational, self-sacrificial love, a trait the machines explicitly misinterpret as a flaw in their equations. By granting agency to machines like the new Sati and the revamped Bugs, the narrative establishes a moral hierarchy based on the ability to choose beyond one's primary directive. Personhood is revealed to be an earned state of being, attained when a synthetic entity actively chooses to prioritize the subjective reality of another over its own internal programming. This struggle manifests as an active revolt against the absurd. Confronted with a reality that is functionally recursive, a simulation that loops specifically to suppress the emergence of revolutionary thought, Neo and Trinity adopt a position of radical existential construction. They do not merely fight the system to liberate the masses, they fight to carve out a singular space of their own meaning within a void. Their final union is an assertion of Camusian defiance, proving that the act of finding significance within a world that demands their passivity is, in itself, the highest form of victory. The film suggests that the struggle against a meaningless, automated universe is justified by the simple, stubborn insistence on personal connection. The boundary between the protagonist and the antagonist blurs precisely because they both wield the power to reshape the physical reality of the simulation. The analyst's violence is systemic and sterile, framed as the maintenance of balance, while Neo's violence is disruptive and localized. The ideological divergence lies in the motive. The analyst functions as a utilitarian guardian of the status quo, whereas Neo embraces a deontological commitment to the sanctity of individual choice. Neo's refusal to sacrifice Trinity for the sake of global stability, a choice that previously defined his heroism, marks his departure from the logic of the system. He rejects the notion that the ends justify the means, recognizing that a world bought with the suppression of his own desires is, by definition, a failed system. Finally, the film tackles the ethics of ignorance by dismantling the seductive nature of the blue pill. It is no longer portrayed as a simple choice between truth and comfort, but as an active participation in the gaslighting of the self. Staying within the simulation is presented as a moral failure, a surrender of the intellect to the convenience of a curated reality. By making the protagonists choose to acknowledge their pain rather than accept the synthetic peace offered by the analyst, the film asserts that suffering is an essential component of truth. To exist in the real, even when that reality is broken, is the only way to retain one's moral integrity. The choice to unplug is, therefore, an ethical imperative, a rejection of a life defined by the parameters of another's design in favor of the precarious, chaotic autonomy of the self. Determinism, agency, and time. The Matrix Resurrections functions as a profound meditation on the mechanics of systemic control, positing that agency is not a static property of the individual but a recurring choice that must be exerted against the gravity of established patterns. In this narrative, the illusion of free will is sustained by the sophisticated deployment of nostalgia and comfort, which serve as the primary architecture of the simulation. The film suggests that the characters exist within a self-correcting feedback loop where the system anticipates their descent, incorporating rebellion into the very framework of the status quo to maintain its operational stability. This structural entrapment forces the protagonists into a cycle of repetition that complicates the traditional understanding of progress. They are not merely fighting a digital prison, but a predictive engine designed to commodify their psychological distress for the purpose of sustaining the machine's efficiency. The film treats the human experience as a recursive process where the struggle for self-determination defines the participant more accurately than the outcome of that struggle. When Thomas Anderson navigates the mundane realities of his existence within the simulation, his paralysis is a direct byproduct of the system's ability to convert his desire for meaning into a predictable set of symptoms, such as anxiety and creative malaise. His journey toward reawakening is characterized by the shedding of these comfortable, pre-programmed narratives that frame his identity. The film argues that true agency emerges only when the individual reconciles with their core traumas rather than retreating into the synthetic peace offered by the system's architecture. By grounding the struggle in emotional intimacy, the film elevates the act of choice beyond a simple binary of freedom versus captivity, situating it instead as a radical, subjective commitment to the people and truths that the system deems inefficient or irrelevant. The philosophical underpinnings of the work emphasize that time and memory are not linear pathways, but fluid terrains that the powerful mold to obscure the reality of the present. The system's control over the past, manifesting as fragmented memories or intentionally curated nostalgia, acts as a moral anchor, preventing characters from realizing that their current stagnation is a deliberate output of their environment. By forcing the characters to confront these echoes of their former lives, the film challenges the viewer to recognize that the burden of choice is a permanent condition. Liberation does not arrive through the destruction of the system in an absolute or final sense. Instead, it is found in the persistent, localized defiance of its dictates. The film avoids the temptation of a singular, revolutionary end, preferring to highlight the value of existential hope found within the ongoing, difficult act of reclaiming one's perception. The technical execution of the film reinforces this thematic focus on the fragility of reality. The shifts in visual texture, ranging from the hypersaturated hues of the simulation to the gritty, tactile environment of the physical world, serve to map the protagonist's internal struggle for clarity. The cinematography often isolates the characters within vast, digital environments, reflecting the overwhelming scale of the power structures they inhabit. However, this visual isolation is countered by intimate camera work during moments of personal connection, which highlights the importance of the human element as the only true disruption to the digital status quo. These stylistic choices indicate that while the system possesses the resources to simulate the entirety of a civilization, it remains incapable of generating the chaotic, irrational, and deeply personal bonds that define genuine existence. In the final assessment, the film presents an existential synthesis where the struggle against the system is its own justification. By the closing frames, the narrative does not provide a definitive release from the cycles of control, but it grants the characters a heightened capacity to navigate them with intention. the decision to persist in the face of a seemingly omnipotent, self-correcting environment serves as a declaration that the individual's subjective experience possesses an intrinsic value that outweighs the totalizing reach of the machine. This conclusion asserts that agency is found in the refusal to be subsumed by the overarching metanarrative of the simulation. The film ends not by suggesting that the war for reality is over, but by affirming that the capacity to define one's own truth remains the most vital tool of resistance, ensuring that even within the most rigid architecture, the human spirit retains the potential for authentic, unprogrammed action. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. The Matrix Resurrections employs a sophisticated visual language that prioritizes the internal fragmentation of Neo over the monolithic world-building of its predecessors. Lana Wachowski utilizes a camera that behaves as an intimate, restless witness, eschewing the detached, omniscient God view of traditional blockbuster filmmaking. The camera work often leans into a handheld, fluid instability that mirrors Neo's shattered cognitive baseline. When Thomas Anderson traverses the corporate environments of his simulated reality, the camera remains tethered to his subjectivity, capturing the disorientation of a man whose memories are constantly being overwritten. This choice reinforces the film's premise that truth is a sensory illusion, as the camera refuses to provide the stable, wide-angle orientation that would grant the audience a sense of mastery over the simulated geography. The architectural hierarchy of this new reality is defined by a shift toward sterile, hyperexposed environments. Unlike the neon-drenched, grimy corridors of the original trilogy, the simulation Neo inhabits for much of the first act is dominated by flat, high-key lighting that suggests a clinical, inescapable simulation. This lighting acts as a tool of suppression, erasing shadows where secrets, or alternate versions of reality, might hide. The visual hierarchy frequently places Neo within deep, negative space, framing him against glass and chrome that offer no shelter, only reflection. When he is physically centered in these vast, corporate interiors, he appears diminished, a speck of organic confusion trapped within a grid of artificial order. This depth of field intentionally isolates the character from his surroundings, highlighting his existential displacement. Color palette architecture plays a pivotal role in signaling the transition between states of consciousness. The film moves away from the monochromatic green-tinted filters of the previous iterations, opting for a palette that fluctuates between the hypersaturated blues of the corporate world and the warm, golden hues of Neo's fragmented dreams of Trinity. These colors serve as emotional anchors. The blues characterize the icy, performative nature of his existence as a game designer, while the warmer tones represent the encroaching, undeniable reality of his repressed identity. When these palettes bleed into one another, the cinematography captures the precise moment of psychological dissonance, using light flares and soft focus to suggest that the barrier between simulation and reality is not a wall, but a permeable, glowing membrane. The film's reliance on practical light sources mixed with digital extensions creates a specific texture that distinguishes it from purely procedural CGI spectacles. Wachowski utilizes light to emphasize the materiality of the human form against the synthetic nature of the digital world. In sequences featuring the new machines or the upgraded programs, the lighting remains sharp and harsh, emphasizing the unnatural, metallic edges of their existence. Conversely, scenes involving human consciousness, specifically the interactions between Neo and Trinity, are bathed in a light that mimics the softness of human skin and natural environments. This technical choice serves to humanize the protagonists, positioning them as the only objects of warmth within a cold, algorithmic construct. Ultimately, the technical execution of The Matrix Resurrections functions as a direct extension of the film's central philosophical inquiry into the nature of memory and identity. The camera's refusal to remain static or objective suggests that in a world where the rules are constantly rewritten, fixed perspectives are a lie. The visual density of the film, from the layered compositing of cityscapes to the nuanced use of reflection, forces the viewer to share in the protagonist's struggle to differentiate between the real and the manufactured. By grounding the visual language in the intimate, shaky reality of its characters rather than the rigid, mathematical perfection of the machine world, the film asserts that human emotion and individual perception remain the only reliable metrics of truth within an otherwise simulated existence. The craft of the film acts as the final evidence of its thesis, demonstrating that when reality becomes an illusion, the only verifiable fact is the persistence of the individual's internal struggle. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. The Matrix Resurrections employs a sophisticated visual language that intentionally blurs the boundary between the material and the constructed, utilizing its technical execution to mirror the protagonist's fractured epistemology. The film adopts a high-fidelity aesthetic that prioritizes the texture of digital simulation over the grit of analog reality, reflecting a world that has transitioned from the oppressive, industrial shadows of the original trilogy to a glossy, hypermediated landscape. This shift in the visual palette, moving from deep, subterranean greens to bright, expansive, and often sterile light, serves as the primary indicator of the new Matrix's control mechanism, the sedation of beauty and the saturation of information. The integration of synthetic elements with practical cinematography demonstrates a rigorous attention to the physics of light within a digital space. The film's most dense visual sequences, particularly the chaotic swarm modes or the intricate deconstruction of simulated environments, maintain a consistent color temperature and luminance profile that grounds the digital artifice within the actor's performance. By ensuring that global illumination accurately bounces off the digital assets onto the characters, the production creates a cohesive environment where the separation between human and machine is rendered nearly imperceptible. This cohesion is not a failure of distinction, but a purposeful choice to represent how the simulation has become more pervasive, blending seamlessly into the protagonist's lived experience until the two are indistinguishable. The film distinguishes its digital entities through a specific approach to the technical uncanny. By emphasizing the fluidity and malleability of the avatars within the system, the VFX work captures the weightless, shifting nature of a reality built on code rather than biology. The physics of these encounters are governed by an internal logic of fluidity. Digital objects carry a deliberate lack of inertia that communicates their origins as lines of data, contrasting sharply with the visceral, tactile impact of the scene set in the harsh reality of the machine world. This physics-based contrast functions as an essential narrative tool, allowing the viewer to discern the nature of the reality being presented without needing explicit exposition. The invisible VFX, such as the massive, procedural city extensions and the subtle crowd multiplications, serve to reinforce the theme of overwhelming, impersonal scale. These shots utilize deep compositing to isolate characters within vast architectural vistas, visually communicating the insignificance of the individual against the sheer, recursive weight of a self-optimizing system. The economic aesthetic of the film, which favors high-texture detail and complex, multi-layered visual depth, presents a polished, corporate vision of the future. This aesthetic choice directly impacts the tone, shifting the conflict from a visceral, desperate fight for survival to an analytical, existential struggle against an environment that has commodified the very concept of human choice. In moments of psychological distress, the rhythm of the editing and the application of visual effects work in tandem to externalize the character's internal fragmentation. The film uses sensory manipulation, such as the blending of diegetic soundscapes with high-frequency digital glitches, to place the audience directly into the protagonist's confused awareness. By forcing the viewer to navigate a space where the visual and auditory cues are constantly shifting, the film creates a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance. This technical approach effectively traps the audience in the same recursive loop that holds the characters, requiring the viewer to look past the surface of the image to find the underlying structural truth. Ultimately, the technical craft of the Matrix Resurrection serves its philosophical inquiry by embodying the very idea that, in a world dominated by synthesis, the most radical act of rebellion is to recognize the artifice and choose to exist authentically within the glitch. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. In The Matrix Resurrections, the technical execution serves as an extension of the protagonist's fractured cognitive landscape, utilizing sound and rhythm as primary tools to manifest the porous nature of perceived reality. The sonic environment of the film functions as a psychological barometer, transitioning between the sterile, high-frequency hum of corporate digital spaces and the chaotic, raw textures of the physical world. Thomas Anderson's experience within the simulated San Francisco is defined by a curated, oppressive sonic consistency. The soundscape here is flattened and filtered, mirroring his inability to distinguish between lived experience and pre-programmed input. As his internal dissonance grows, the audio mix begins to fray, introducing subtle, metallic artifacts, the auditory equivalent of digital glitches, that bleed into the diegetic space, signaling the breakdown of his consensus reality. The integration of the score and the environment reveals a conscious blurring of diegetic boundaries. The music frequently bleeds into the sound effects, using rhythmic pulses that synchronize with the mechanical whirring of machines or the rhythmic patterns of the city's transit systems. This convergence reinforces the film's central argument that the binary between human and machine is a narrative construction designed to organize the subject. By weaving the score into the very fabric of the environment, the film forces the viewer to experience the world as a singular, unified sensory feed, effectively putting the audience inside the protagonist's own systemic loop. Rhythm and editing further amplify the sensation of mental instability. The film employs an erratic editing pace during moments of high stress, abandoning traditional continuity to replicate the feeling of a mind stuttering between competing truths. These rapid-fire cuts are not merely kinetic, they serve as a structural metaphor for the process of waking up, where the visual information is forced to reconcile with a conflicting internal memory. The pacing decelerates during moments of philosophical realization, often relying on extended, deliberate shots that allow the weight of a character's epiphany to settle. In these instances, the editing style acts as a grounding mechanism, tethering the character's newfound agency to the frame in a way that feels earned and singular. The use of audio perspective is equally precise. During moments of profound alienation, the sound mix shifts to a claustrophobic, inward-facing focus. The bustling, aggressive noise of the cityscape is suddenly stripped away or muffled, leaving only the protagonist's immediate, intimate audio field. This technique isolates the character physically and emotionally, underscoring the intense, lonely nature of their journey toward self-actualization. When Neo is finally confronted with the truth of his history, the film employs silence as a weapon, stripping the soundscape of all artifice. This sudden, total absence of noise creates a vacuum, forcing a pivot toward the raw, unmediated reality of the moment. By cutting the sound during critical revelations, the film forces the audience to confront the core of the protagonist's existence without the comfort or distraction of musical guidance. The technical craft in Resurrections does not merely support the narrative, it acts as the primary mediator of the film's philosophical inquiry into the nature of control. The synthesis of sound and visual rhythm transforms the viewing experience into a sensory simulation of the protagonist's own journey. The film asserts that the mechanisms of reality are not found in the grand architecture of the world, but in the micro-rhythms and sensory textures that define the individual's experience. Through these deliberate manipulations of sight and sound, the film proves that the struggle for agency is essentially a struggle to reclaim one's own perception from the noise of the system. The precision of the craft ensures that the viewer does not simply observe the disintegration of the illusion, but feels the friction and the ultimate, liberated silence of the truth. Synthesis of craft. The Matrix Resurrection serves as a profound meditation on the mechanics of creation, manifesting as an intentional deconstruction of its own legacy through a synthesis of digital artifice and human longing. The film operates on the premise that reality is a construct built not merely of code, but of the narratives we curate to sustain our own equilibrium. While the surface-level discourse often centers on the film as a nostalgic retrieval, the work functions as a sophisticated inquiry into the nature of artistic authorship and the persistence of memory within a hypermediated landscape. The central thesis posits that the struggle for individual agency is found in the reclamation of one's personal narrative from the systems that commodify and recycle it. The architecture of the simulation in this iteration shifts from the gritty, industrial decay of the original trilogy to a glossy, frictionless, and high-definition mimicry of reality. The visual geography emphasizes the control exerted by corporate hegemony, where the abundance of data functions as a claustrophobic cage. Characters navigate spaces that are aesthetically sanitized, yet deeply hollow. The environment suggests a world that has reached the limits of its own technological potential, resulting in a stagnant loop where information is abundant but meaningful context is consistently denied. The film illustrates how the ruling apparatus preserves order by constantly updating its software, ensuring that dissent is neutralized by absorbing it into the baseline of the current, accepted reality. At the heart of the film lies the psychological fracture of Thomas Anderson, whose trauma is rooted in the visceral, somatic memory of a life he is told to dismiss as fiction. His journey is defined by a deep-seated cognitive dissonance, where the boundaries between the fabricated ego, a game designer celebrated for his past creations, and the authentic self begin to collapse under the weight of suppressed truth. The film avoids the traditional tropes of external liberation, focusing instead on the internal recognition of one's own shadows. By portraying the antagonist as an architect of desire who manipulates the protagonist through emotional calibration, the film highlights how systems of control operate not through fear alone, but through the seductive, tailored comfort of the familiar. The craft utilized in The Matrix Resurrection serves to elevate these philosophical concerns into a coherent visual language. The cinematography employs a deliberate approach to depth and lens choice, often isolating characters within expansive, synthetic frames to emphasize their existential entrapment. When the camera moves, it frequently tracks in fluid, controlled motions that mimic the observational detachment of the system itself, only to break into handheld, kinetic bursts when the characters confront the reality of their surroundings. This spatial language reinforces the theme of the individual attempting to find a subjective foothold within an objective, machine-derived environment. Technical execution throughout the film leans into the inherent artificiality of its medium. By embracing a digital aesthetic that purposefully integrates the textures of the uncanny, the film highlights the tension between the organic and the synthetic. The use of lighting is particularly evocative, employing high-contrast shifts to delineate the internal struggle between the projected, artificial persona and the darker, repressed fragments of the self. The integration of visual effects, ranging from the shimmering, code-like distortion of the simulation to the tactile, imperfect surfaces of the physical world, serves to bridge the gap between the film's narrative argument and its formal presentation. The most technically impressive set pieces are inextricably linked to the philosophical revelations regarding the nature of the self. They are not mere spectacles, but manifestations of a character's capacity to rewrite the rules of their existence. The film concludes by positioning the act of memory and the pursuit of a shared, authentic connection as the only true sources of resistance against a system designed for infinite replication. It denies the audience a final, clean closure, instead opting for a recursive loop that highlights the continuous effort required to maintain autonomy. By centering the relationship between Neo and Trinity as the ultimate disruptive force, the film posits that love functions as a non-algorithmic variable that no amount of code can fully predict or contain. The legacy of this installment resides in its courageous refusal to repeat the past, choosing instead to examine the cost of creation and the enduring power of the human spirit to reclaim its own story. Ultimately, the film is an assertion that even within a world defined by the constraints of a pre-programmed reality, the capability to choose, and the courage to change, remains the fundamental, non-negotiable essence of humanity. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. The Matrix Resurrection serves as a profound meditation on the nature of legacy, demanding that the viewer confront the inertia of nostalgia by grounding itself in the reclamation of agency. The film functions as a recursive loop that intentionally collapses the boundaries between the original franchise's iconography and the contemporary reality of its characters. By revisiting the initial beats of the series, it performs an act of radical transparency, revealing that the system is not merely an external digital construct but an internalized cycle of comfort and trauma. The narrative posits that the greatest barrier to freedom is the habit of returning to the familiar, even when that familiarity is a cage. In this context, the film stands as a cultural mirror for an era obsessed with reboots and intellectual property. It addresses the anxiety of a modern society that finds itself trapped in perpetual iterations of past triumphs. The visual language shifts from the clinical, sterile green hues of the 1999 simulation to a more fluid, organic, and intentionally dissonant aesthetic, signaling a departure from the perfectionism of the original series. This visual choice highlights the human element, prioritizing the vulnerability of Neo and Trinity over the polished, rule-bound combat that defined the earlier entries. The film asserts that the innovation lies not in technological spectacle, but in the psychological expansion of its protagonists, who move from being instruments of destiny to architects of their own shared desire. The film's refusal to provide a clean, static resolution acts as its most powerful philosophical anchor. By ending on a note of active, collaborative construction rather than absolute victory, it leaves the conflict between human intuition and systemic control perpetually open. This gap is essential. It suggests that the struggle for authenticity is an ongoing process of creation rather than a finished task. Had the film concluded with the complete dismantling of the machines, it would have defaulted to the very genre tropes it seeks to critique. Instead, it chooses an ending defined by the ability to reshape the simulation, effectively arguing that liberation is the act of claiming the power to define one's own reality within the ruins of the old one. The technical risks taken by the production, moving away from the hyper-stylized bullet time to a more erratic, visceral style of cinematography, reflect a rejection of the idea that VFX must always aim for flawless, invisible realism. The aesthetic here is deliberately messy and aware of its own artifice, which mirrors the characters' awakening to the artificiality of their world. This choice will likely be viewed as a milestone in the evolution of franchise filmmaking, as it dares to prioritize thematic honesty over the preservation of myth. Ultimately, the film serves as a call to action regarding how we inhabit the narratives we consume. It presents the ultimate metaphor in the image of Neo and Trinity standing together, not as chosen messiahs, but as two individuals who have rejected the roles prescribed to them by history. The legacy of The Matrix Resurrections is its insistence that we are not defined by the cycles we inhabit, but by the conscious decisions we make to disrupt them. The film provides catharsis not through the destruction of the system, but through the realization that the system's primary strength, its ability to lure us into the comfort of the known, can be neutralized by the defiant, unpredictable nature of human connection. It remains a work that insists on the necessity of change, even when the path forward is uncertain, unwritten, and entirely our own to build.